special guest, we'll meet him in a moment, is Robert Moss, who co-authored with Arnaud de Bourgeois' Spike. His new book is Death Theme, certainly another spy novel in the spy genre, which Mr. Moss has become most accomplished. He's, by the way, a columnist for the Daily Telegraph in London, former editor of the Economist Intelligence Bulletin's Foreign Report, a contributor to magazines and newspapers around the world like the New York Times and Harper's and Commentary, New Republic, National Review, Saturday Review, and Policy Review. He frequently lectures at the NATO military colleges, one-time advisor to Prime Minister Thatcher. He travels Europe and the United States, lectures extensively as an expert on international terrorism.
The plot. I have a character in this book, Death Theme, who's called Misha. He's the head of the East German spy service. And I modeled him, in some ways, fairly closely on the real-life head of the East German intelligence service. Misha was destined for a bit part in this book. He took center stage. I became so fascinated by his devious, subtle character that I couldn't deny him a bigger role than I had intended. I can't say that, no. I have a central cast of 5 characters in Death Theme, who, as I say, I now intend to have as the mainstays of a cycle of espionage novels of different settings and tackling different problems. I think we've got to draw some distinctions. I'm a voracious reader of everything that appears in the whole spy fiction genre. I love it all. But nonetheless, some of it is floating fairly free from reality. I think one of the differences between a book like Death Theme and The Spike before it, and a lot of what appears in the spy fiction genre, is that I've made the effort to bring in real-life situations, and this involves a great deal of background research. And so things that are being depicted here are not purely fantastic. For example, I give a lot of scenes inside Moscow Center, show how the Soviet spy services are operating, describe locations, code words, modus operandi, and so on. I couldn't have done this without recent conversations with a friend of mine, who's a very recent detective from the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU. The code names that are described in this book, the communications techniques, for example, how they use fishing rods that are in fact electronic transmitters to send signals under a lake to an agent on the other side. And they called it Death Star. And then something very strange and awesome happened. Darth Vader threatened to do us in. The people who own the rights to the Star Wars series told us that Death Star is a registered trademark. It is the battleship of Darth Vader, and we'd better change the title. And so, you know, Larry, I'm prepared. I'm prepared to take on the KGB or even the CIA, but I'm not prepared to tangle with an 8-foot extraterrestrial alien who has no face. One of the main themes of Death Theme is that the next war, if there is one, is going to be won or lost in space. In the novel, the Soviets are working on a space weapon, a beam weapon, an irradiation beam of incomparable power, which could be fired from a satellite with the effect of a giant neutron bomb, killing lots of people without damaging real estate. For a while, the CIA is not convinced that this weapon is real, even when a Russian detective comes out and says, you'd better take notice of it. They're still caught up in a web of deception and disinformation. When the Americans finally decide that the weapon is real and could be the ultimate horror, could put the United States in a losing position, a band of secret operatives who call themselves the Club get together and sabotage it in the wilds of Central Asia. That is the central theme. The subplots cover things ranging from international terrorism through the operations of the East German spy service, through the competition between the spy agencies in Washington and in Moscow. One of the subplots involves the struggle for power in Moscow after Brezhnev's death. Well, I like his deviousness. You know, Marcus Wolf, who is a real-life head of the East German spy service and is called Misha by the Russians, who's trained in the Soviet Union, has a number of distinctions. First of all, he is probably the longest surviving spy chief in the world. He's been in his job for about 30 years. Secondly, he is the only Jewish chief of a spy service in the Soviet bloc. He doesn't make...
German.
He's a German. He's a German Jew. At any rate, although he makes nothing out of this for his own reasons, he has relatives on a kibbutz in northern Israel who say they are his cousins. So I was interested in developing the fictional figure of Misha, who's also a German Jew, by the conflict of loyalty that I feel must arise from a man in his position when he watches the Russian leadership becoming more and more militaristic, more and more racist, using anti-Semitic themes to build up popular support for discredited policies. In real life, the Soviet armed forces have been the recipients of a barrage of propaganda in recent years, reviving racist and anti-Semitic themes reminiscent of the 1930s. This is part of the effort of a militarist faction in Moscow to make a public appeal at a time when communism has lost its glamour. So in the book, here's his Misha. What does he do? He feels threatened by these new tendencies in Moscow. He's always depended on the Russians. He's always been a loyal Soviet-line socialist. But also as a Jew and as a man of intelligence and sensitivity and independence, he becomes a little restless. So I wanted to explore the conflict of loyalty, and that's what became most fascinating. The book is say one thing, though, which addresses the deeper part of your question, and it's this. I would distinguish myself from some other writers in the genre of spy fiction, in the sense that I don't believe that there's an absolute moral neutralism in these things. I don't believe that Russians and Americans and British are all down in the mud, fighting each other at the same gross level. I believe that there are men who try for the best, and there are men who are trying their damnedest to do the worst. And I think we have to understand the nature of the Soviet system, which is so different from our own. We have to understand that a totalitarian system is to be viewed in different moral respects, and that its instruments, like the KGB, are operating in a moral void with a ruthlessness that we never approach. I'll give you a case in the book. A mole who is working for the CIA inside Russian intelligence is detected. He's arrested in Moscow. He's put on trial secretly, and he's executed by being pushed alive into the oven of a crematorium. Now, this fictional scene from Death Beam happened in real life. That is what the Soviets did to one of their own men who was spying for the United States. I stumbled across it, so to speak, as a reporter in the early days. I was visiting places like Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. I came into contact with revolutionary groups. I interviewed revolutionary leaders and counterinsurgency leaders. And I became convinced 10 or 11 years ago that we were going to see a serious upsurge in urban political violence in Western democracies. Unfortunately, that prediction became accurate. I wrote a book about 10 years ago called Urban Guerrillas. It's still a standard text at NATO academies. And having written that book, I found myself regarded as an instant expert. I say that self-mockingly, but I found that terrorism was something that I could never escape as a subject for debate, for discussion, for investigation from that time onwards. It's not a pleasant subject, but it's one that is very immediate to us. Let us, in the very immediate future, I see a great deal to fear from terrorists equipped with much simpler weapons than nuclear devices or nerve gas or laser beams. One of the fictional scenarios in Death Beam, for example, involves a Palestinian operative trained by the Soviets who tries to kill the President of the United States with a very simple weapon. It's a handheld, heat-seeking SAM-7 rocket. He tries to fire it from the window of the Hay Adams Hotel at the presidential helicopter. Now, this SAM-7 is a thing you can pick up with two fingers. Only an idiot could fail to fire it accurately. You just have to wait 6 seconds for the heat sensors to lock onto the engine of a plane or a helicopter. So a lot of these things are run. Gaddafi has hundreds and hundreds of them, which he's distributing merrily to some of his Palestinian friends and other terror groups that he supports. I think that in the wave of terrorism we can expect over the next year, it's the simpler, more primitive weapon, a value-free definition, which we can apply to groups whose stated political goals we may sympathize with or hate. My definition for terrorist is a very simple one. In my book, a terrorist is a man who uses violence against civilians for political purposes. Simple and straightforward. Now, if you happen to be sympathetic to the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland, well, to its stated goals, if you happen to be in favor of independence in Northern Ireland, I think you must still accept that the IRA is a terrorist organization in that specific value-free sense. To both about it, I would maintain that I probably have to add a further clause to my definition of terrorist, because I would regard, in addition to what I've said, I would regard a group that uses political violence in a society that allows the means of peaceful change to the democratic process to be terrorists also. My first simple definition I would apply to all situations regardless of whether the society is a democracy or not. I would also add to that in my view, a group is a terrorist group if it uses political violence in a society that offers the means of democratic change.
Part a little inside terrorism. If the people are downtrodden, well, you would think that there would be more fear in Moscow of buildings being blown up or Brezhnev being shot than in the United States of buildings being blown up and Reagan being shot. Yet the opposite's true.
Okay. Well, the reason is very simple. The reason is that motivation, justification, is not the only thing that produces terrorism or revolutionary violence. Opportunity is the key factor to consider. There's little opportunity for political violence inside the Soviet Union or for dissent in any form. Why? Because there's an extremely capable and efficient and ruthless secret police organization which maintains tremendous social control. Furthermore, The reason, I think, why we see so much terrorism in non-communist societies is that the Soviet bloc is backing terrorism against us and against our friends. Gaddafi is a fanatic. He is one of the inspired of Allah in his own terms. He talks to Allah. I'm quite convinced that he believes that he has a direct line to Allah and that he serves purposes which only he and Allah comprehend. In addition to this, however, Gaddafi is a tool and a puppet, and to some extent an agent of the Soviet Union, which has turned his country into the 10th largest armored power in the world. This has been their great achievement. I think that Gaddafi believes that he has an Allah-given, Allah-awarded right and duty to promote revolution in every corner of the world, and he's going about it with a systematic zeal which makes Libya probably the primary exporter of political violence in the world today. I believe that his people love him. There have been many plots against him, including plots involving his own armed forces and his own secret service. I know that he has people in this country. I was talking with a friend of mine who's in the police out on the West Coast the other day, and he told me about Gaddafi's efforts to re-establish some kind of underground network there for potential terrorist operations. What they are targeting, apparently, are electrical power installations. I think his goal is to make himself, first of all, the leader of the radical Arab world, and secondly, the leader of the revolutionary cause throughout the world. I believe that he wants Libya, under his leadership, to be a world power. That's why he wants a nuclear bomb so devoutly. I believe that he wants to destabilize all societies that are not in sympathy with his own goals. His friends should think that I wouldn't rule out the possibility that at some stage in the future the Soviets themselves might attempt to remove Gaddafi in order to install someone more reliable and less inspired by Allah in Tripoli in his place.
Discussing the MX, Herbert Scoville, said that rather than being so involved with our own warheads and the like, that the Soviet Union and the United States should, in a combined effort, look to get rid of him.
Look to get rid of Gaddafi. I think that that would be very nice in the best of all possible worlds. But
the Soviet Union needs him now?
The Soviet Union needs him and uses him.
But he must use
the things that he's been using them for is as a barrier against an attempt to overthrow him. He has Soviet bodies between him and the Egyptian border. I mean, there are Soviet advisors there. There are Soviet arms depots inside his frontier with Egypt. They are a physical barrier, in his view, to an Egyptian attack on Libya. He used to put it quite frankly and explicitly that we should be in the business of removing Mr. Gaddafi, and I don't think that is an immoral or unjustifiable thing for the United States to set about. I believe, furthermore, that if the United States had given Sadat the backing that he wanted in his desire to get rid of Gaddafi, that Sadat would be alive today. The United States has been out of the business of seeking to overthrow foreign governments for some time, and in the view of many of us, that's a good thing. But there are occasions when you have an international terrorist regime of the order of Gaddafi's regime in Libya, when I think the civilized community has a right and duty to take action. That he will act. It's a reality that from one year to the next, Gaddafi is giving increased financing and support to international terrorist networks, and he's training people from all tendencies. He's training extreme rightists as well as extreme leftists. This is part of the strangeness of the Libyan situation. The Italians who've been trained in Libya have come back and said, oh, well, there are neo-fascists in the same camp as revolutionary communists. It's an almost surreal picture when you look at it. So that in Tunisia last year, some rebels were put on trial who had tried to overthrow the Tunisian government. They said they'd been trained in Libya just like a lot of other people, and they'd met all types there. They met some Americans, they met some IRA people, they'd met some Germans. And on a Russian warship, a dismantled Russian warship anchored off Tobruk, they had met Egyptian radicals who were being trained for a plot to overthrow Sadat. There's still the question of whether Gaddafi was involved in the assassination of Sadat. I hold him morally responsible, even if it wasn't his agents directly controlled from Tripoli who killed Sadat. I hold him morally responsible. Mossad probably is the best, most efficient secret service operating in the West today. It has to be. The reason is very simple. The Israelis, unlike other Western countries, cannot afford to lose a single war. In order to avoid losing a war, in order to avoid being taken by surprise by their enemies, they must have an intelligence service which can fulfill the basic duty of any secret service, to forewarn of enemy attack. Now, the Mossad and Israeli intelligence has not been all-seeing and all-effective. They were taken by surprise in 1973, and that led to great soul-searching and worrying at the top in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But in general, particularly in dealing with terrorism, by the way, Mossad has earned its reputation. The only way that you can deal effectively with terrorism, in my view, and this is the Israelis' view too, is what I would call the combination of penetration and preemption. This means getting informers, agents inside terrorist organizations who can tell you what they're up to, forewarn you before they strike, thereby enabling you to act and preempt them. The Israelis do that with deadly efficiency. KGB is second to no one in the sheer scale of its resources, in its manpower levels and in its money, and it has additional advantages. It operates in a climate of total secrecy. The Soviet citizens are not told about it. You can't file a Freedom of Information lawsuit in Moscow and get the archives of the KGB tumbling out of the vault. It's answerable only to a self-appointed party elite, not to Congress or the media. These are all tremendous assets. The defect from which it suffers is that under these conditions, it becomes a highly bureaucratic organization, prey to inefficiency, corruption, backbiting, and internal intrigue. The Russians, by the way, try to deal with this. They try to keep the KGB on its toes by putting it in a competitive situation. There is another Soviet service called the GRU, the Military Intelligence Service. The KGB and the GRU are kept deliberately in a competitive situation. Russia is not a capitalist society, but it is capitalism red in tooth and claw.
We have a similar competition. Doesn't our Defense Department have it?
The department certainly there's the DIA and there are the individual service intelligence organizations, but they're not on the scale of the Soviet GRU, and they're not running human agents around the world in great numbers the way the Soviet GRU is. Picture this, Larry, and our listeners can see this too, I think. 6:30 every morning, the Politburo in Moscow receives two rival competitive intelligence reports, one from the KGB, one from the GRU. The pressure is on. Who is going to be right? Who's called the shots correctly? Who's picked up most agents for the last 24-hour period? They're fighting with each other. That keeps them on their toes. And the pressure, this is something that I can't exaggerate. My friend who I mentioned earlier, this recent defector, told me about his first posting in a European country. He arrives, this GRU man, the Soviet spy. He goes to visit his station chief 3 days after he arrives in the European country. The station chief waves an airline ticket under his nose, an Aeroflot airline ticket. And he says, I hope you haven't unpacked your bags. And the Soviet case officer is horrified and puzzled. He says, what do you mean, sir? His boss says, look, you haven't recruited an agent yet. The Soviet case officer says, but I've only been here 3 days. His chief says, you have 1 week to recruit an agent. I'll have your Aeroflot ticket in my desk, and you'll be going back to Moscow if you don't succeed. Now, I'm not saying that our corporations and government organizations in the West don't put the heat on occasionally, but the Soviets do that with intensity.
Do you think the Russians are coming? The Russians are coming?
Well, we can spoof the concept. It doesn't really help us to deal with the issue. I think in a realistic sense, the Russians pose more of a threat to us today than ever in the past. And they, in my view, they pose more of a threat to the Western democracies than anything we have seen since the fall of Nazi Germany.
Do we not pose it?
I think we often hear a lot, and people like Herbert Scoville talk about this, about the supposed defensive mentality of the Soviets. I've read a lot of Soviet military writings. I've talked to experts on the Soviet Union and defectors from the Soviet bloc. I find that their military literature for internal consumption stresses the following ideas: that they want to be number one, that they believe it's a good socialist idea to have military supremacy, that they believe in a first strike, and that they believe in surprise. I don't find the excessively defensive mentality that we discuss in the West.
Thank you very much.
Matter brought up, I can only think of one thing. I can say that we Yanks, we can stand tall and proud. We're still number one because no one else has ever dropped an atom bomb on anybody. I want to ask your guest this question. Do you really honestly believe that expanding U.S. militarism or any other type of militarism, including hiring more CIA agents and things of that sort, will actually solve any problems for humanity?
I don't believe that expanding militarism will solve any problems for humanity. I think if we're going to prevent a real risk of war from developing, then the Western alliance has to be able to defend itself. The last report of the Defense Department under Jimmy Carter, before Reagan came in, said that the Russians were outspending the U.S. by 50% on military hardware in general and by 85% on research and development. The recent Weinberger report on the Soviet military build-up said that in this area of space weapons, of laser and beam weapons, the Russians are spending 3 to 5 times as much as the United States. Now, these are significant figures. In the big, bad, dangerous world, there is a country, the Soviet Union, which poses a strategic threat to this country, which has spy services many times bigger than the CIA, and that you can't just bury your head in the sand and ignore that. I wish 25 years the Soviets have been working on a beam weapons program to make these death rays into real life. They've already tested killer satellites that can blow up satellites in space. That's of significance to this country because 80% of U.S. military communications depend on space right now. The Russians, according to Aviation Week magazine, the current issue, have put a laser beam on board a satellite ready to send it up into space. This they hope to use to burn up U.S. missiles and aircraft. The beam of the title of Death Beam is beyond that. It's an irradiation beam of incomparable power, as you said, that could work like a giant neutron bomb, killing people without damaging real estate. This, I hope, is something that will always remain on the drawing boards. But we do know that the Russians have been working on it with a very intensive scientific program for many, many years. And the Pentagon calls this Soviet program 4-7 in real life. I think that this is where the action is going to be at in terms of the military race in coming years, these space weapons. And I think that for the first time, in terms of military technologies, the Russians have stolen a lead over the United States.
But which that the Soviet Union is sponsoring terrorism against the United States. Walter LaCour's book on terrorism, which I think is far superior to anything Mr. Moss has written, and I've looked at his books, also makes that claim tentatively without proof. Now, can Mr. Moss give any substantial evidence or proof of this, or cite one solid reference where it can be found?
About the fact that the head of the PLO office in Moscow, Mohammed al-Shayir, declared proudly and publicly earlier this year that 2,000 Palestinians are being trained in the Soviet Union.
That's not being used against the United States, which was your claim.
Oh, it's a question of what the phrase against the United States means. I would suggest that attacks against allies of the United States should be viewed as attacks on the United States also. We all hang together in these matters. I think that, but I'll give you another case which immediately relates to terrorism inside the United States. How about this one? Back in the 50s, as you may remember, groups of Puerto Rican terrorists tried to kill President Harry Truman, and they opened fire on U.S. congressmen sitting in the House of Representatives on Capitol Hill. The lady who led that group that was shooting at the congressman on Capitol Hill was called Lolita Lebron. She was let out of jail by Jimmy Carter in 1979. 2 months ago, there was a mass rally in Havana at which Fidel Castro introduced Lolita Lebron as a heroine of the Puerto Rican Revolution. Castro was, in other words, giving public and enthusiastic endorsement to a Puerto Rican terrorist who had carried out a major act of violence in this country. Fidel Castro is a puppet of the Soviet Union. His secret service is controlled by the KGB. He gets $8 million a day from the Soviet government. He does nothing without the blessing of the Soviets. That, to me, is pretty clear evidence of Soviet bloc involvement in terrorism right here inside the United States.
Correspondence saying that the CIA had gotten you to write a book about Chile, and it was entitled Chile's Marxist Experiment.
Right.
Your alleged relationship with the CIA.
I'm very glad that you raised it. The Guardian did publish this allegation. I sued them for libel, and I got apologies and retractions. And I sued others who repeated the same allegation and got very substantial financial damages. I'd like to comment on that episode because it's very interesting as a case of what happens to people who take controversial positions on controversial issues in life. Philip Agee, the CIA defector, was the origin, really, of the allegation that I had connections with the CIA, which, as I say, and as you said, was publicized in Britain about 5 years ago. Philip Agee has close connections with the Cuban Secret Service and with the Russians, now that he's turned on his former employers, the CIA. I believe that those attacks on me at that time were the result of the fact that I had been involved with Margaret Thatcher, then the leader of the opposition Conservative Party in Britain, and was identified in a newspaper article as being responsible for writing a speech for her attacking the Soviet military buildup, which led the Russians to call her the Iron Lady. Following that speech and that leak, I became the target for a number of smear attacks, and to this day I continue to be attacked in the Soviet media on average about once a week, with all sorts of labels. For the record, I'd just like to say on this show, I've never worked for any government agency, American, Western, or whatever, and said once that if you label something effectively, you don't have to argue with it. That is at the root of McCarthyism in all its shapes and forms. We know McCarthyism from the right. I deplore that bitterly. But there's also McCarthyism from the left. And there has been a tendency on the part of some radicals on the left, such as the ones who broadcast Agee's allegations in Britain, to try to smear and discredit those with whom they don't disagree with labels like CIA agent, supporter of the military-industrial complex, right-winger, etc. I would probably come in, we'd have to put the Britain. The problem that we have which you've reminded us, and thank you for doing that, is that in manpower and resources, the Soviets have not one but two secret services which outrank and outnumber, above all outnumber, what's available on the Western side. Have those figures, they can only be guessed at. I asked the defector I quoted earlier the same question: what is the budget of the GRU? What can the GRU, the military intelligence side, pay for secrets from the West? He said on important areas the budget is almost limitless. I asked him what did he mean. He said, you've got to understand that our spy service on the military side, the GRU, is in effect the research and development department for the Soviet military industry as well. There's a body in Moscow called the Military Industrial Commission, which puts out a 500-page book every year listing areas of technology the Soviets haven't got or can get more cheaply through spying than through development. The GRU goes out to get these things, so you can see it immediately. If it costs you $5 million to buy a piece of technology from an agent in the West, that it would cost you $100 million to develop for yourself, you've made a tremendous saving. That's partly why the budget for operations is so enormous.
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, it's a hotbed of liberalism that needs some...
I am coming to Minneapolis. Thank you for your encouragement to do that. Directorate A of the KGB, or Service A as they've now taken to calling it, they keep expanding it and giving it a bigger and better title, is that department of the Soviet Secret Service which concerns itself with feeding deception to the West, or disinformation. Not just with that, but with a whole range of what the Russians call active measures, which also covers fomenting riots, strikes, demonstrations, backing peace movements and other front organizations, and so on. But the main achievement of this department of the KGB, Service A, has been to feed deception, disinformation into our media and government organizations. This is an unremitting task for them. It became public in France recently in a very interesting case involving a French journalist called Parfait, who for 20 years was working under KGB guidance to feed false information into French newspapers. That became known. He was arrested in contact with a Soviet agent and put in jail. He's been let out again, but a lot became public through that case. The Dutch kicked out a KGB man from Holland earlier this year called Vadim Leonov. This is an interesting case of which I've seen no publicity in the United States. Leonov was quoted in a Dutch newspaper, Die Telegraaf, recently as describing, I don't think he believed he was going to be quoted, he was having a conversation with a church contact actually, he was quoted as describing how he had personally gathered together the organizers of peace rallies in Holland, and he boasted that he could get 50,000 people into the streets through his channels whenever he liked. That's another example of Directorate A in operation. Another part of the task of this outfit within the KGB is to discredit politicians, commentators, and prominent individuals in the West who are hostile to Soviet objectives. They develop psychological profiles on people that they don't like, and they devote a great deal of time and energy to trying to smear and discredit such people. They've tried to do that to some of our leaders and some of our commentators. On the question of, where the Saudis and others stand in relation to PLO terrorism, well, the Saudis, of course, are bankrolling the PLO. They're providing about $400 million a year for the PLO. There are people who will tell us that the PLO is not a terrorist organization. I happen to disagree with them. And I think that the Saudis have the habit of throwing money at any problem that comes up. Therefore, The Guardian was the first to print this allegation. It was printed by a couple of journalists who've been associated with Philip Agee. This was in the week of Christmas in 76. 3 or 4 days later in that week of Christmas 76, The Guardian published a statement saying that they had not meant to imply in any way that I'd ever acted under orders or influence of the CIA. Similar statements, some of them rather more groveling, appeared in other publications that had run the same story, and I received damages from the papers involved. Full statements of the legal proceedings were published in the Daily Telegraph, in the Daily Mail, and in other British newspapers, in the Times of London. The other question, the Ben Wattenberg point. This was very interesting. It was indeed U.S.-made precision ball-bearing equipment that enabled the Russians to master the technology of putting multiple warheads on their missiles, the so-called MIRVing process. This was only one example of how equipment sold, in this case, I believe, quite legally to the Soviet Union, has helped the Russians to expand their war machine. Another case, which I find very revealing, is that IBM computer technology that was sold to the Soviet Union in 1972 enabled them to refine their guidance systems required for their missiles and for their space satellites. Now, that IBM sophisticated computer technology sold in '72 was sold supposedly to help Intourist, the Russian tourist bookings agency, to improve its reservation system. It was immediately deployed by the Soviet military industry for their missile guidance.
Thank you.
Yes, I can foresee intelligence collaboration. It was thanks to an Israeli intelligence tip-off that Sadat was able to forestall a Gaddafi-backed assassination plot a year or so ago. The Israelis helped to keep Sadat alive prior to his assassination, so there was that degree of intelligence coordination. I can imagine that Egyptian and Israeli intelligence might concert their efforts to deal with some problems that are of mutual concern, such as the problem of Gaddafi.
True that their dollar is not our dollar in where it goes.
Yeah, this is true, but you know, the cheap manpower and the conscription of manpower for the armed forces is a big asset for them. You have to look. Let's take 2 points related to this. The first is the following. They have a group called the Military Industrial Commission, which coordinates their defense spending in general. This involves 11 ministries, not just the defense ministry. They have a ministry of shipbuilding in the Soviet Union. It doesn't build any civilian ships. It just builds military vessels. The non-military vessels are commissioned outside the Soviet Union. So once you start to figure out what they spend, you have to add up the work of more than the defense ministry itself, which is very rarely done. The second thing is that they conscript and pay very low wages to a couple of million young Russians every 2 years. They're standing armed forces of 4.8 million. These are impressive numbers. But, all right, let's accept we are always going to be running around disputing exact figures for the Soviet defense effort. When you look at the specific categories of weaponry that they are developing, the numbers of submarines, the numbers of missiles, the number of tanks, the number of fighter planes, in those categories you find that their numbers have come to be much bigger than those of the United States. That's the bottom line. I think it's unfortunate myself that any Western government should give the PLO any degree of legitimacy or quasi-diplomatic recognition. In my book, this is not a legitimate organization. It's a society of assassins, so you won't find any disagreement with me on that score. On the laser front, I should tell you that there is a hot new thing under discussion in Washington, which is called the X-ray laser. In fact, it's a result of a breakthrough by British scientists, which has been developed further in the United States. This laser, I don't profess as a non-scientist to understand all the technology involved, but I am told that it has the capacity to cut through atmospheric disturbances better than other existing chemical lasers that have been studied. The particle beam weapon is in these areas, I think, the ultimate weapon. I agree with your general characterization of the greater capacities of the particle beam weapon. I think the reason why the United States has gone further with lasers has quite simply been that U.S. scientists have had difficulty resolving all the problems involved in generating sufficient power and conveying sufficient power into the form of, in a sense, a gigantic bullet of electric energy that is required to make the particle beam work in a weapons capacity. I think that U.S. research into this field is not only continuing, but is being accelerated as part of a deliberate policy by the Reagan administration. We'll have to wait and see what the consequences are. In the meantime, I think the Russians have gone further with particle beam scientific development. Yeah. The United Nations is a marvelous haven for spies from all over the world. And there's no doubt that the Soviets and their satellites, including the Cubans, use the UN facilities in New York intensively for espionage and disinformation activities. A very high proportion of the Soviet so-called diplomats attached to the United Nations in New York are known to have connections with the KGB or the Soviet GRU, and the fact that it is in New York on United Nations soil obviously gives them a base for their activities, which we do not have inside the Soviet bloc.
Yep, interests of even-handedness in the Middle East. Correct. Number one, quick. Ms. Moss, I'll allow you your sort of following the Russian-Cuban to American problems thing, mentioning the 8 million a day to Cuba.
Right.
If you will allow me, let's see, next year's budget to Israel will be over 8 million per day. And I think that is certainly a client state operation that we have, and we're talking, of course, about 3.1 million
Israelis, and we're talking about 10 million Cubans. We're talking...
Is Israel to the United States as Cuba is to the Soviet Union?
Well, there are two differences that lead to the I-3, in fact. The first is that Israel is a democracy and Cuba is a communist puppet state. The second is that Cuba is exporting Soviet-line revolution all over the world. Angola is held by a Cuban expeditionary force of 20,000 men. The Cubans are active in backing terrorism and violence all over the world. These are very sizable differences. I don't see how you can possibly draw a comparison between two such dissimilar situations. Now, many countries that don't have foreign intelligence services, in other words, that don't have services that are in the business of monitoring or spying upon other countries.
Some big ones.
Canada does not have a foreign intelligence service. Japan, to my knowledge, does not have a foreign intelligence service, although some Japanese businessmen seem to be very good at finding out what they need to know. We can't lump all the Muslim countries together for a start because of the role the Soviets are choosing to play in the radical Arab world. The Soviets have taken on the training of intelligence officers from a number of Muslim countries in the Arab world. The Soviets have on a 6-month basis been providing training courses for intelligence officers from Syria, Libya, South Yemen, and so on. They've done this for the Iraqis, too, under the Soviet-Iraqi Treaty of 1972. So these people are being schooled by the KGB in its own methods, and we shouldn't imagine them as Koran-waving Islamic fundamentalists. They are perhaps not as professional as the KGB, but they're trying to get there. Let's take the Iranian case. You brought it up. Okay, we had a great media witch hunt against the Shah of Iran and a wicked, repressive, corrupt regime. Then we got the Ayatollah, partly as a result, in my view, of the role of the media in isolating the Shah from our sympathy and support. And I was offended, as a journalist who knew Iran a bit, by the fact that we didn't seem to lavish such moral outrage on the crimes being committed by the Ayatollah in those early days. Then the embassy was seized, the hostage situation came about, the media got interested again because American lives were at stake. But we hadn't heard in detail in the media about things like the hanging judge, or really the stoning judge, Ayatollah al-Hali, who was selecting the stones that would be used to kill people. You know, you select small stones, if you're going to throw them at someone to make him die, because it'll take longer if you really want to prolong it. We didn't hear as much about that. And I wondered whether it is that for a lot of people in the media, the only people worth attacking are friends of this country.